Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this morning's webinar for standard drafters. This webinar will talk you through the checklist for writers and editors of documents. You will see that's a very useful checklist, so please.
Yes.
My name is Els, by the way, and I'll be the webinar moderator today. Please be informed that you're all muted, just to make it a fluent webinar. So you can post your questions in the questions and answers panel in the GoToWebinar application. Should you be on Twitter, you can also tweet, of course, about the webinar. Our login is the standards for EU Twitter account. So please feel free to fill in your questions during the presentation. We will get back to you after the presentation to answer the questions. Should your question not be replied, it will be posted on the CENELEC website as soon as possible with an answer to your question. So thank you very much. And I welcome today the two speakers of this webinar. It's Amy Jane Conley and Frederic Dufour that will talk you through it. Good morning.
Good morning, everybody. So my name is Amy Jane Conley, and I'm an project manager editor in the energy and living sector.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Frederic Dufour, and I work as an editor in the mobility standardization and digital solutions bubble.
Yeah, so today's webinar, we're going to be talking about the checklist found in the Internal Regulations Part 3, Annex A. We're just going to go through some of the key points with some brief explanations on what these things mean. We then have for you a brief tips for standards drafters of homegrown documents only, and just some things to remember while you're drafting and also before you submit your draft to us. And then right at the end, we'll have a short break and then a little Q&A session. So the Internal Regulations Part 3 checklist is, as I said, found in Annex A. And it looks something like this and just follows the structure of a CENELEC deliverable while mentioning the drafting aspects to be checked. And one thing we would like you just to be aware of is the better the quality of draft we have at the start of the process before you submit your draft to us, we'll have an unparalleled quality at publication. So this is precisely why we do these webinars, why we're here to help you so early on in the drafting procedure. So now to pass over to Fred, who's going to take us through the checklist.
So the first drafting aspect at the top of the checklist concerns the structure and use of plain language. So first of all, please use the simplified templates available on the CEN bus for CEN drafts and final drafts, and CENELEC bus for CENELEC drafts and final drafts. And if you follow these templates, you can't go wrong, because these templates correspond to the actual structure of a CEN and or CENELEC deliverable, and the structure contained in the template meets the structure as described in the Internal Regulations Part 3. Now, you may have a look at these rules from the checklist. Regarding the main part is please avoid hanging paragraphs, which is something we have to pay attention when we're editing drafts and final drafts at CCMC. Hanging paragraphs are this type of structure, where you can see there is one paragraph just below the title of clause 5, but this paragraph isn't contained in subclause 5.1. So here is the example of a wrong structure with a hanging paragraph, and there is another example with the right structure in which the same paragraph is contained in a subclause 5.1 general. This rule to avoid hanging paragraphs also aims at avoiding that any element may be in a text may be easily cross-referred to in the document or in another document. Please be aware that the title has to be clear and concise, and that it is supposed to distinguish the subject matter from that of other documents. And as you will know, it is composed of separate elements, with the introductory element being common to the various parts, if any. The following element in the structure is the European foreword, which is a mandatory element. You have to be aware that a European foreword is to be drafted according to certain certain rules. In case of revisions, please include the superseding information and list of technical changes, and it shall not include requirements, permissions, or recommendations. Regarding the following element is the introduction, which is an optional element. You can see these two questions from the checklist regarding the introduction. Is it purely informative, which means that there shall not be any normative elements or elements that should appear to a normative part of the text that would appear in an introduction. And the second aspect is, does it describe the content or give information on why the document is needed? And indeed, an introduction describes the content of a document. It explains why the standard is needed. And as I said just now, it shall not contain any normative element, which means it shall not include requirements. And you have to know that an introduction is required if you have patent rights. Regarding this question of patent rights, Amy will describe it more in detail later on in the presentation. Now, the following mandatory element in a draft is the scope, which is a mandatory element. The scope is here to describe what the document does, and it also gives a summary of the subject and limits of applicability of the deliverable. Please be aware that a scope gives a series of statements of fact. You have to know that you may not have any requirement, permission, or recommendation. If you have a look at this print screen just below, you can see this. You may read out: this European standard establishes, specifies, gives guidelines for, defines, or this European standard is applicable to. Please be aware that a scope shall only start with this type of wording, as a scope is supposed to give statements of fact only. Now we come to the normative references. The normative references are a mandatory element in a draft. And this is new in the internal regulation part 3, because back in the past, if there weren't references that were normatively referred to in the document, you weren't supposed to have a clause 2, but now it is mandatory, even if there's no normative reference in the rest of the document. I'll show you more about this in a minute. And the introductory paragraph is supposed to be this one. The following documents are referred to in the text in such a way that some or all of their content constitutes requirements of this document. For dated references, only the edition cited applies. For undated references, the latest edition of the referenced document, including any amendments, applies. As you know, this part lists the documents that are normatively cited in the text. And as I said just now, it needs to be mentioned even if there is no normative reference and even if it is empty, in which case the following sentence will appear instead of the introductory paragraph. There are no normative references in this document. Please be aware that if there are references to non-international or non-European standards, we need a TC decision. still about normative references, you may wonder now, what does normatively cited mean exactly? Well, here on the left side of the screen, you have an example of a normative reference. Connectors shall conform to the electric characteristics specified by EN 60603 Part 7, Subpart 1. Indeed, here you have a normative reference because of the presence of the verb shall, which indicates a requirement. And on the right side of the screen, you have an informative reference. Connectors should conform to the electrical characteristics specified by EN 6603 Part 7, Subpart 1. Here should expresses the idea of a recommendation, and therefore this reference may only be informative in this very context. Please make sure that the references cited in clause 2 are actually cited elsewhere normatively in the text. For more modal verbs expressing requirements, because there are other verbs than shall, please see the internal regulations part 3, table 3. Now, still about normative references. When should your reference be dated? If there is a reference to a specific subclause, figure, table, or equation in the standard, the reference is to be dated. So it will be dated at this very spot in the text, and it will be dated in clause 2 as well. Here is an example. Pipes shall comply with the requirements given in EN 1780 2015-84. Now, if there is a reference to a whole document, which means if the reference concerns a whole document in its entirety and not only a clause, subclause, figure, table, or equation, the reference will not be dated in the text at the concerned spot and in clause 2. If the reference is to be dated, please refer to the latest edition, as the editions mentioned in clause 2 are to be fully available to any person reading the standard or deliverable. And remember what I said just now. If it's dated in the text, please date it also in clause 2. And you have to know that normative references may be either ENs or PRENs, which are nationally available. So please don't make any normative reference to an FPREN, to a withdrawn, abandoned, in the pipeline, so to speak, or closed standard in clause 2. As I said 2 minutes ago, references are to be fully active, available, and up to date. Now that I've covered normative references, here is another big part in a document, terms and definitions, which is another mandatory element. As in the case of clause 2 dedicated to normative references, and this is new in the internal regulations part 3, there shall always be a terms and definitions clause, even if there are no terms and definitions. I'll tell you more about this in a minute. You have to know that terms, and this clause gives definitions to some terms used in the document so as to facilitate a common understanding of the deliverable. The introductory text is the following one. For the purposes of this document, the following terms and definitions apply. ISO and IEC maintain terminological databases for use in standardization at the following addresses, and then the addresses of the IEC Electropedia and ISO online pricing platform. As I said one minute ago, this clause needs to be mentioned, even if it is empty, and if there are no terms and definitions. In that case, the first paragraph will be replaced with the following one, which says, no terms and definitions are listed in this document. Regarding another aspect, drafting aspect, is figures. Indeed, these figures are an important part of the checklist. Why? Because they are needed to present the information more clearly. And you have to know that figures are to be contained in a separate folder for CEN drafts and final drafts, and that figures, in that case, have to have a TIFF or EPS extension. Now, for CENELEC documents, we would encourage you to send you the figures in a separately apart from the document, so as to make our editing work easier. Otherwise, we have to extract the figures and reinsert them into the drafts and final drafts, so as to prepare an XML version. Regarding the naming of files, and this concerns CEN drafts and final drafts, figures in a text are to be called 001, 002, or FIG underscore or FIG underscore 2, etc. for figures 1 and 2. Subfigures are to be called similarly 001A, 001B, or FIG underscore 1A, FIG underscore 1B, etc. Figures and annexes are to be called A001, B001, and so on. Figures and tables. In the case of figures and tables, these will be called TBL underscore and then the number that applies. And in the case of figures in keys, the key figures may be called FIG underscore 1 or 001 underscore 1, and so on. And figures shall be language neutral. And the resolution, sorry if this gets really technical, but in the case of CEN drafts and final drafts, figures have to have a DPI of 600, a compression, an LZW compression, and the sizing is to be 100%. In the text, figures are to be numbered continuously, starting at 1. And a key to a figure is to be drafted separately, preferably in a table, and it shall not appear underneath the figure directly. Otherwise, you have to type it out all over again. Now, another mandatory element is, on the CEN side, it is obligatory to provide all figure files with the document at the time of transmission. So, if there are no figures apart from the text would be likely to be rejected. And on the CENELEC side, as I said, it's not obligatory, but it's very helpful for us. So please, if you can do so, please do. If we don't have the figure files, indeed, for CENELEC drafts and final drafts, the quality may be poor, and we may have to contact you, the TC. And if subfigures need a key, there has to be one single key for all subfigures combined. And if one key isn't possible, please use separate figures in the text. And do not provide figures to replace an entire table, as tables shall be editable and not be figures. So please pay attention to the quality of figures, and if you are unsure, please contact us. We are ready to reply any question. And please check the quality of the figures. You can do so if you use Projects Online. Because Projects Online is a password protected application available for CEN and CENELEC members organizations and CEN and CENELEC TC secretaries. You may do so if you use that application showed by the red arrow. Regarding graphical symbols, well, when the TC is aware that a graphical symbol with a specific meaning is already registered in ISO, it should quote this in its standard. This can be done in the title of the symbol. In any case, graphical symbols are to be identified as figures and followed with the reference number. But please make sure to contact ISO TC145 if you want to ensure a proper use of graphical symbols. And one more time, because it's worth repeating this. If you are unsure, please do not hesitate to contact us. So please let me hold the floor to my colleague, Miss M. Jane Conley, who will describe to you further aspects.
Thanks, Fred. So now moving on to tables. So tables, they need to be simply drafted. They need to have a concise, simple, and easy to understand title. So nothing too long, not a full phrase or anything like that. They need to be numbered correctly. So one table should have one number, no subtables. So table 1A, table 1B. So for example, we have table 1, protection class requirements. Nice and simply drafted, nice and simple to understand. Cross-referencing, is it mentioned in the text? And as I said, simply drafted, so no diagonal lines, and try to avoid merging and splitting cells because this causes us problems when we prepare the XML file. And as Fred mentioned earlier, please don't give us any images as tables. We have to be able to edit them. The translators need to be able to edit them too. So this is something we will definitely contact you about. We also can't have any nested tables. So this basically means when you have a table contained within a cell. So as you can see here, the little red table in that cell is a nested table. This causes us so many problems. They're quite difficult for us to get rid of and to put into the text in a way that you're happy with, but also in a way that we can work with. It's easier just to completely avoid them, but we can sort of look at ways to get around them case by case. If it's absolutely necessary to have them, then do get in touch with us and we will see what we can do. As I've said, draft them simply. Landscape is possible to fit information in, so please don't feel like you have to keep it to a portrait page. If landscape is easier to draft it in, please do. We can help you with that. If you are new to Microsoft Word or you feel a bit stuck in what to do, get in touch and we'll help you. And then try not to use any spaces or tabs to align the text. So along the top of your page in Microsoft Word, you see these little highlighted yellow tabs. Try to use those to align the text. It's a little bit easier and again causes us less problems with this XML version. So then moving on to annexes, is there a reference to each annex in the main part of the text? And is their status normative or informative correct? And is this made clear in the main part of the text? So what does this mean? Well, first of all, annexes are normative or informative, and that means no requirements are allowed in informative annexes. This is something we check for and we will remove them, we'll let you know. Is there an in-text citation? So just to give you an example of informative and normative, if you just say see Annex A or see Annex B or for more information Annex A, that's informative. But if you have according to Annex B, it's normative. And that can help you determine whether your annex is informative or normative. And new part of IR3, there's no need to order them in the order they appear in the text. So if you have a reference to Annex B first and then a reference to Annex A, that's perfectly fine if you have A and B right at the end of the text. So now the bibliography is an informative element. It can't contain any normative references. This is something that we do consistently check. Is it formatted consistently? So either we have everything numbered or nothing numbered. It's entirely your choice. If you have bibliographic references in the text, it kind of makes sense to number them if you have them numbered in the text, but it's not obligatory. We also would like you to go from EN to ISO and IEC, then external, books, legal, that kind of organization for them. Just keep all the same references together. It looks a lot neater, it's easier to use. are the entries correct and complete? So sometimes we do get a few entries for, say, books or external references or even legal directive references, which are incomplete. Now, we're not technical experts, the editors, so we don't really know what you're trying to use. We don't know what the correct reference is with regards to these books and other such documents. So we can't really check them as thoroughly as the drafter can, as thoroughly as the TC can. So do make sure that your entries are correct, they're complete, they're up to date, so that there won't be any problems when it comes to publication stage. And just make sure there are no duplicate references found in clause 2 either. We do check for this, but sometimes 1 or 2 just slip through. So make sure of that. So then we have drafting of provisions. This is a little bit ominous, but it basically just covers things like using shall, should, or may, and that kind of thing. So it covers the use of shall, should, or may, and making sure they're not in the foreword, the scope, or in any notes. This is absolutely something we change. It's something we check for at every stage, and we will remove them. You need to make sure that shall is not used in the introduction. Make sure you use may and can correctly. Must is also not a requirement. We're going to discuss that in a little bit. And obviously no requirement specifying compliance with legal and national regulations. So what does all this mean? Well, with the European foreword, scope and notes, it's fairly clear. No shall, no should, or may. That is, no requirements, recommendations, or permissions. In the introduction, no shall, so no requirements. We are going to go through a few more ways of expressing these shortly. And then may, so permission, and can, a statement of fact. Is this used correctly? Now, there is a bit of confusion regarding may and can. They do, certainly for me as a native English speaker, they can both mean permissions, they can both mean statements of facts, but the best way to go about this is to just stick to what's written in IR3. So may is a permission and can is a statement of fact. Now, must is a little bit awkward. Sometimes we see this used as a requirement, but in actual fact, if you refer to Table 7 in Internal Regulations Part 3, it's actually an external constraint. There's a bit more information on this, but effectively the takeaway from this is not to use it as a requirement. This is something that we do go through and change. So just to be aware, do go and read up on this. Make sure that you're using must correctly and shall correctly. We can't have any requirements specifying compliance with national or legal regulations. And what this means is if you have a directive or a legal text or anything else like that, there can be no requirement to it. We will remove this. It can block texts. It can cause delays. So please just be aware of that. Do try and avoid them completely if possible. No informative parts can have requirements or normative elements. So simple way of remembering this, an informative annex can't have requirements in. But if you're not sure, do get in touch. And then finally, for drafting of provisions, we just have 1 or 2 tables to help you. So these are very, very simple to understand. They're quite comprehensive in my opinion. You have some good examples of how to express shall in other ways, shall not in other ways. We have should and should not for recommendations, may and need not for permissions, and then possibility and capability, so the use of can and cannot. So it's worth looking at those. These help us to avoid any kind of ambiguity, any kind of confusion. They're really useful tables, and the surrounding text as well in the Internal Regulations Part 3 is very useful. And the tables that you see here, Table 3, 4, 5, and 6, these are the tables in Internal Regulations Part 3. So do take a look at those. So potential legal problems, we have 3 very simple points here: copyright, trademarks, and patents. So first of all, copyright information. It's quite a heavy topic, this. So rather than go into it completely in this webinar today, we're just going to give you some information on where to go. But again, if you need any help, get in touch with us. We can take it case by case and we can help you through it. We can direct you. So for copyright information, it's a good idea to look at Clause 32 in the Internal Regulations Part 3, but also the Internal Regulations Part 1, Clauses 4.2 and 6.4, and see also Guide 10, CENELEC Guide 10, which is available on the CEN BOSS and the CENELEC BOSS. It's all there for you. The same thing with trademarks. So we ask that you try and avoid using specific products in the standards, but if it's not possible, then this footnote that you can see on the screen is very, very useful. This footnote we've taken directly from clause 26.6 in the internal regulations part 3. So it's worth taking a look at that, just making sure you're using this properly. But the best way is just to avoid specific products. It makes everyone's life easier. And then with patents, the same thing, bit more information here. There's, as Fred mentioned earlier, in the introduction, if you have patents, it's obligatory to have your introduction. There is specific text that you have to have. Just a little bit of information about the patent that you're referring to. And at publication stage, you'll notice that there's no patent sentence in the European Foreword, because obviously you have this in the introduction. It's pointless for us to put it into the European Foreword, and that applies to CEN and CENELEC as well. And it's worth looking at CENELEC Guide 8 for the registration of patent form. This needs to be completed and submitted as soon as possible by the TC, because if we don't have this form, we can't publish. So just be aware, if you have patents, as soon as possible, preferably at inquiry stage, get that form to us, get it registered with us, and then we can publish without any problems at all. So another confusing topic sometimes is conformity assessment. So we just ask you to be aware of any potential conformity assessment issues. Again, if you are struggling, if you don't know what to do, get in touch with us. We'd be more than happy to help you more. But try and solve all the problems before you submit your text to us. This is the easiest way to avoid any delays. Did you take any contact with CENELEC JTC1? There is a future webinar date. I believe we now have the date of it, possibly. But you can find a bit more information at this link on our website in the usual area. They will go a lot more in depth about conformity assessment there. And of course, there's more information on the CEN and CENELEC BOSS sites found at these links here. I think these will be available to you at a later date, so definitely do take a look at those. So now a little bit of a lighter topic, cross-references. Goes without saying, are they all correct? Make sure that reference clauses actually exist in the text. We do get a few texts in that refer to a clause that is non-existent in the text. There's also no external reference, so just make sure that they actually exist within the text somewhere. Are your references to tables, figures, and annexes correct? So make sure that Annex B in the text is actually Annex B and not Annex C or D. Make sure that your figures are correct, of course. With regards to drafting and formatting, try as best you can to avoid field codes and auto numbers. It causes loads of problems when we process for XML. We can get error messages. Things get what we call flattened, which basically just means it reverts it to the original style and messes up all the numbering. So try and avoid field codes and auto numbers. Again, if you're confused, get in touch and we can explain a bit more about this. And again, your cross-references to external documents, are they correct? Again, we can't be 100% certain that the reference you're trying to use is correct for your text. So that is, for us, something that you really should check just before you submit your text. Okay, so now we have just a very short tips for standards drafters. Now, this is just some things that we have come up with while we edit the text. Specific problems aren't necessarily covered in the internal regulations Part 3 checklist, but are still very useful, interesting, and important for you to know. So a little bit more on normative references to expand on what Fred talked about. As I've briefly mentioned, specifically no EU regulations, directives, or legal text, and we will change these out. So we have a few examples here. The dimensions of pipe shall be according to Directive 2009-29 EC. We will change this to should be according to, or even for more information on C. If you are referring to directives in the text, try and use the last two, the green text. It's much easier, it solves any problems, it avoids delays. A little bit on formulae, which isn't mentioned in the checklist, but is still very important. Where possible, we ask you to draft in math type, which I know a lot of TCs, a lot of drafters don't have access to, but if it's unavailable, we ask that you do consider downloading it, especially if you have a lot of deliverables that contain an awful lot of equations. It's definitely worth downloading it because we use it. We convert text, we convert equations into math type. However, if you only have 1 or 2 equations every now and again, draft them in the equation tool in Word and we will convert them. But just be aware that this does mean we get possibly a poorer quality. There's more potential for problems because, as I keep saying, the editors are not technical experts. A lot of the time we don't know what these equations mean. So it's always better if we can avoid problems where possible with such a normative technical element. And with regards to formatting, try not to lay out the formulae in tables. Instead, use a tab. Even if it doesn't look great at first, we can format it to make it look perfect, to make it look beautiful. And pay close attention to correctness. As I said, we don't really know what's correct and what's not correct with the technical content of these formulas. At inquiry and formal vote stage, it's super important to pay attention to correctness. We can't change formulae at publication stage. We're going to discuss this later on, but just be aware, inquiry and formal vote, make sure they are correct and perfect with no problems. So then moving on to publication issues, this is something that we often tell you about, but we never really explain why. So you often hear us say, no technical changes, we can't make any technical changes, or you'll read the comments that say rejected, technical change, no. But what do we mean by this? It's basically something which changes the technical content of the standard itself, or something that changes the scope or parameter of a requirement, or something which adds or removes a requirement. Those are the 3 main reasons why we can't make a change within the text. So we just have a little example here. This is a real life example that we have come across. So we have here replace to shall by can. This is in fact removing a requirement and changing it to a statement of fact. Absolutely not, we can't do this. And also replace shall by can again. So do be aware of that. So why can't we make these changes? Well, for starters, at publication stage, the text is approved as it is by members as a whole. So if we were to make this change, it would in fact decrease the transparency. So if you imagine the text is agreed on, but one member wishes to amend or change or remove a requirement, if we make this change, no one else has a say in it. It's an unfair process. It's not very transparent, so it's not fair. Everybody needs to have a say at the end of the day because all members are going to be using these deliverables. So just to be aware of that. And one thing we would like you to take away from this is that we're not saying that you're wrong. We're not saying that you are incorrect. We're not disagreeing with you. As I keep saying, we're not technical experts, so we might agree with you, but our hands are tied with regards to what we can and can't change. So as much as we would love to help you, in most cases we can't at publication stage. So do be aware of that inquiry and formal vote stage, because we do want to help you. We want to make this a nice process. So that said, what changes can we make? As you can see there, we have a nice comment accepted and implemented because somebody wanted us to remove some commas in the sentence stated. We then have, can you please correct the font size and correct the indentation? These are all formatting, editorial comments, things like that. If you do disagree with something though that we've changed or that we've not changed, do ask us why. We're more than happy to explain a little bit. But hopefully this is cleared a little bit up for you. And then finally, this is something relatively new. So there was a BT Decision 17, 2018, which stated no more resubmissions at inquiry and formal vote stage. So this is applicable to all documents delivered to CCMC as of the 30th of April 2018. And this includes the first delivery, so the draft that you send to us, or the second delivery, which is the draft that we send to translation. So that means when you send us the text for the first time, unless there's something majorly wrong with it, you can't send anything else in. We have to edit the text that you send the first time. And the text that we edit, if there's another problem with it, it has to wait until the next stage. We can't send another draft to translation. Publication, however, resubmissions are okay to send to the translators. So if you see anything wrong that you've perhaps missed, or something that we've changed that maybe you missed during the TC proofing, it's absolutely fine for us to send a resubmission to translators. However, you do need to expect a delay of 2 weeks if a resubmission is requested, because obviously we have to give the translators a little bit of time to re-prepare the text to go through the whole process again. So just expect a delay of 2 weeks on the date of availability. So some final words.
Yes, please let me hold the floor once again, and please let me remind you the following rule. Please pay attention to the draft you send to CCMC.
If you're unsure about absolutely any aspect of the drafting procedure, contact your editor. If you have their name, get in touch.
And the TC doesn't need to be the one to contact us. We're happy to speak directly to working groups and drafters.
And don't forget, editor meetings are completely free and they are very, very useful. We can join you via Skype, via GoToMeeting, if you're in Brussels, in person, via telephone. Do get in touch.
And if you notice a drafting issue while your document is at inquiry or formal vote, even translation, let us know before publication. We can make any change to the text before publication, but only if we know.
And don't forget, any editor at all is able to help with your problems, so don't wait until you submit your draft to ask us your questions. If you have the contact details of an editor or even a CCMC contact point at all, they can always forward your question to an editor. So get in touch and ask anybody